Before the war had a name, the world still breathed in balance. Not peace without tension, but order held gently in place. Heaven remained high and measured. Earth turned through its seasons without hesitation. Humanity moved between them, fragile yet deliberate, carrying memory, labor, and prayer. Ancient memory describes this age not as innocent but as aligned. Boundaries existed, visible even when ignored. Into this alignment came the Nephilim. They were not born from earth alone, nor entirely of heaven. They emerged at the crossing of realms, carrying strength that bent landscapes and lifespans that stretched far beyond human counting. Some traditions speak of them as towering, others simply as enduring. What mattered was not their height, but their weight upon the world. At first, their presence felt protective. They raised walls where floods threatened. They carved roads through stone. Valleys learned their shadows. Cities grew beneath their oversight, and humanity learned both fear and reliance. When danger came, giants stood. When disputes rose, giants judged. It seemed for a time that the world had gained guardians. Yet time does not treat all beings equally. Human generations passed like smoke. Children grew, aged, and vanished while the Nephilim remained. Watching this repetition slowly altered them. Patience thinned. Familiar faces disappeared too quickly. The world began to feel unstable, not because it changed, but because it changed without them. Desire arrived quietly. Not hunger for violence, but for permanence. To rule not only land, but direction. To shape outcomes before they formed. Ancient writers suggest this was the first fracture. Not rebellion, but assumption. The belief that longevity granted authority. That strength implied mandate. As Nephilim influence expanded, cities swelled unnaturally. Trade routes hardened into control lines. The natural order strained beneath unfamiliar pressure. Rivers were redirected, plains became training grounds, hills were reshaped into fortresses, creation adjusted but not without resistance. Heaven did not answer immediately. Law, according to tradition, moves slowly. Judgment waits until every warning has spoken. Signs appeared instead, lights shifting in the night sky, harvests failing out of season, dreams shared among the watchful and the wise. These were not punishments. They were invitations to pause. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Survival began to feel like approval. Power endured, and endurance was mistaken for permission. A boundary stone, untouched for generations, was quietly moved. And with it, the world took its first unsteady breath toward something it would not easily escape. The elders of later ages would say this was still a gentle time. No sky had fallen. No sea had swallowed the land. Yet the stillness carried weight. Wind lingered longer in valleys. Stones remembered footsteps too heavy to forget. Even animals shifted their paths, sensing pressure without language. Human memory from this era speaks in fragments. Songs without endings. Laws without clear origins. People felt guided, yet unsure by whom. Giants walked openly among them, neither hiding nor ruling fully, and this ambiguity shaped everything. Trust existed, but it rested on imbalance. Some Nephilim noticed the signs and felt unease. Later writings suggest a few withdrew to high places, watching rather than shaping. They sensed that crossing limits changed more than outcomes, it altered the self. But their restraint did not slow the larger momentum already forming. The boundary stone remained the quiet symbol. It did not shatter. It did not glow. It was simply moved, marking a shift no ceremony announced. From that moment, the world leaned forward slightly, as if listening for an answer it would eventually receive. This was the world before the final war. Not broken but stretched. Not condemned but warned. The age ended without realizing it had begun to close. And in that quiet narrowing, where power mistook itself for purpose, the foundations of conflict settled into place, waiting for the moment when patience would no longer hold. Long shadows gathered slowly, unseen by those living within them, and the world continued forward, unaware that the balance it trusted was already beginning to slip. No horn sounded, no warning was shouted, yet the air itself seemed to wait, holding breath for what would come. Everything remained calm, but nothing remained unchanged. In the beginning stillness, the world did not shift all at once. It tilted slowly, like a great vessel taking on water drop by drop. Most alive in that age never noticed the tilt beginning. The sun still rose. The rivers still wound through valleys. Children still laughed and learned the rhythms of planting, gathering, and rest. Yet beneath these ordinary motions, the threads holding creation in balance had begun to strain. The Nephilim felt it first, though few understood what. They sensed. Those who lived close to the mountains spoke of hearing the stone breathe differently, an exhale that lingered too long before drawing in again. Forests grew more restless. Animals changed migration earlier than expected. Even the ocean seemed to pulse with a slower, deeper rhythm. These were not disasters. They were discomforts in the world's foundations. Still, the giants continued their work. They expanded settlements, cut new paths through the wilderness, raised structures that towered above the plains. To human eyes, these accomplishments appeared miraculous. They marked a future filled with stability and strength. But every new fortress pressed harder on the land. Every altered river forced another region into imbalance. And every decision made by hands too strong carved a deeper imprint upon the living world. Some traditions say that heaven whispered during this time, not through thunder or visitation, but through subtlety, quiet signs meant for those willing to perceive. A flock of birds turning in the wrong season, a night sky with one star missing, dreams in which boundary stones glowed faintly. These were messages of caution, signals that creation itself needed rest. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Nephilim's longevity, once a gift, hardened into perspective. They began to see humanity as temporary, like reeds bending in the wind. Renewal after renewal blurred together until empathy thinned. A gulf widened, silent, unintentional, but real. And from that gulf emerged a new thought, that those who endure should lead those who fade. This idea spread like heat beneath sand, soft, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. It shaped the way giants interpreted the world around them. When storms disrupted harvests, they took it as a sign that humans were unreliable. When migration changed, they saw only opportunity for expansion. When dreams carried warnings, they dismissed them as old fears trying to restrain new strength. Humanity, sensing the shift, began to change as well. Some clung to the giants for protection, believing proximity to power meant safety. Others withdrew into hidden regions, guarding traditions that had kept their ancestors aligned with the seasons. But neither choice altered the current forming beneath history's surface. By now, the earth itself was responding. Fields that once yielded abundance began producing unevenly, too much one year, too little the next. Streams dried earlier. Winds carried dust where they had once carried rain. The imbalance was gentle but persistent, like a quiet cough that foretells deeper trouble. A few Nephilim felt a growing unease, a sense that the world had begun measuring them. These giants stood apart, listening to the deep places of the earth, recognizing that limits existed not to bind them but to protect the fragile order sustaining all life. But their caution was drowned out by the bolder voices of their kin. It was during this time that the boundary stone was moved, not with ceremony, not with conflict, simply shifted a small distance from where it had rested for centuries. No one claimed responsibility. No one celebrated it. Yet its movement marked the moment when the world's subtle warnings crossed into something firmer. For the first time, the earth answered with tension. Roots thickened, soil hardened, air carried a strange dryness. Birds circled fields without landing. The land was bracing itself, though few recognized the meaning. Human memory from this period describes a quiet heaviness, not fear but anticipation, as though the world itself stood at a threshold, waiting to see what the Nephilim would do next. The giants felt this tension differently, some as challenge, others as encouragement. And so the first stage of the final war continued without a single weapon drawn. It grew through assumptions, through the belief that strength could redefine law, through the slow redirection of a world that had once lived in harmony with its limits. Even as dawns continued to break across the valleys, a deeper twilight settled upon the spirit of the age. Paths remained open, but fewer walked them without glancing toward the horizon. Something was coming, not yet visible but unmistakable, and the question, whispered across generations, carried a weight no one dared answer too soon. How far could creation be pushed before it finally pushed back? In the final stretch of this early age, the world stood in a quiet tension, and inhale held just a moment too long. Most living within it could not decipher the meaning, yet they felt the weight. Even the youngest sensed a subtle shift in the air. Silence lingered differently. Shadows stretched a bit farther at dusk. Water tasted faintly of iron after long rains. These were not disasters, only hints of a deeper imbalance threading through creation. The Nephilim, for all their strength, were not immune to these signs. Some paused in their building, glancing toward the hills as if listening for distant footsteps. Others stood in riverbeds, feeling the water run thinner around their ankles. These moments stirred unease, but not enough to slow the momentum already underway. Giants who had seen centuries believed they understood the world better than those who had lived mere decades. They trusted endurance over discernment. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. A misunderstanding had taken root, subtle but profound. The Nephilim began interpreting the world's warnings as tests rather than boundaries. A failing harvest was a challenge to be overcome by altering the land. A shifting river was an opportunity to redirect its course. A troubling dream was dismissed as relic wisdom fading into irrelevance. Power shaped their perception more than perception shaped their power. Humanity, caught in this rising tide, adjusted in small, telling ways. Families built their homes closer to fortified walls. Elders repeated old teachings with greater urgency, sensing that the threads of order were thinning. Rituals honoring the turning seasons grew more solemn, more cautious. Even in days of calm, people whispered around their fires, recalling stories of earlier ages when the world had grown restless, and remembering that restlessness always carried meaning. The boundary stone, now slightly displaced, stood as the quiet heart of this era's transformation. Most who passed it noticed nothing unusual, yet a few felt unease ripple across their thoughts. The stone's movement was minor in distance but monumental in implication. Boundaries were more than markers of space. They were symbols of relationship, between heaven and earth, between strength and humility, between desire and restraint. When such a marker shifted, even by inches, the unseen fabric it represented shifted as well. The world responded with a series of soft, accumulating omens. A night where the moon dimmed behind a haze that was not cloud. A morning where no birds sang despite clear skies. A season in which trees bore fruit late, almost reluctantly. These events did not strike fear, they planted questions. Why had the familiar grown uncertain? And what force had nudged the first thread loose? The Nephilim, builders, guardians, wanderers, felt these questions but answered them differently. To some, the omens signaled the need for caution. They walked the ridges at dawn, touching the stones, tracing cracks, listening to winds with quiet dread. These giants sensed that the world was straining beneath a weight not meant to be carried, but others misread the moment entirely. They saw a world shifting and believed they were meant to reshape it. If creation trembled, then creation could be commanded. If boundaries moved, then boundaries were meant to be moved. They mistook imbalance for invitation. This divergence in interpretation marked the subtle closing of an era. Harmony was no longer the silent agreement binding all things. Ambition, gentle at first, then firm, began to chisel its place where humility once lived. Still, no clash had erupted. No war drum sounded. The world remained outwardly peaceful. This was the deceptive calm before history bends. The age ended not in violence, but in a shift of posture, the Nephilim leaning forward with intent, the earth leaning back with strain. The lessons of creation are seldom loud. They arrive in pressure, in silence, in restraint. The giants believed themselves steady, yet the world was already beginning to count their steps. By the time the first true violation occurred, the world had already decided it could no longer remain as it was. In the hush between one generation and the next, the balance that once held all things gently in place shuddered. Rivers adjusted their courses as if preparing for change. Forests grew dense in unusual patterns, creating pockets of shadow where sunlight struggled to reach. Even the wind, ancient storyteller of the land, began shaping new paths across the plains. It was in this atmosphere, calm but taut, that the foundations of the final war were quietly laid. The conflict had not yet erupted, but it had already begun. It began the moment strength mistook itself for mandate. It began the moment desire overshadowed restraint. It began when the world realized the Nephilim would not stop testing its limits. And so the chapter closes in a long exhale. No thunder, no decree, only a world holding itself steady, preparing for what it sensed approaching. In the deep silence before dawn, the earth waited, and far above, heaven listened, knowing the next steps would decide the shape of ages to come. The age that followed was not born in a roar, but in a quiet rearranging of power. It began with small shifts, barely noticeable changes in how decisions were made, who was consulted, and whose voices carried weight. Humanity, once accustomed to guiding its own affairs with trembling but earnest hands, found itself gradually stepping back as the Nephilim stepped. Forward not through threats, not through conquest, through presence, through inevitability. Here a mini-hook settles us into the new era. There are seasons in history when change arrives without announcing itself. When footsteps grow heavier, shadows grow longer, and the people living through it cannot name what has begun. They only feel the world leaning in a new direction, as though guided by a force too vast to resist. In such times, dominion does not shout. It settles itself like dust, soft and complete. Ancient traditions speak of this shift as a replacement, not a takeover. Human rulers remained in name, but their authority thinned. Their decisions waited upon the silent approval of giants who stood beside them in council halls. Laws, once rooted in custom and memory, bent according to the will of those who had seen centuries. A Nephilim's judgment, swift, heavy, unquestionable, became the final word in disputes. And so, step by step, coexistence hardened into hierarchy. But this was only the beginning. To the Nephilim, human history unfolded too quickly to anchor meaning. Generations flickered like candles in wind, each new leader echoing the fears and hopes of the one before. Empires rose with great ceremony only to crumble before a single Nephilim had grown tired of watching. Such brevity dulled their sympathy. When existence stretches across ages, stewardship can blur into superiority. When strength persists, restraint begins to feel unnecessary. And so the giants asked themselves quiet, dangerous questions. Why preserve what cannot last? Why limit what seems unending? Landmarks once shared became possessions. Valleys were claimed as personal dominions. Rivers redirected with the sweep of an arm. Forests cleared so their pillars of stone could rise higher. Humanity adapted first with awe, then with dependence, then with unease. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The world itself responded, softly resisting. Rivers overflowed without storm. Fields yielded strange, uneven harvests. Animals migrated across unfamiliar paths. These were not disasters, only discomforts, creation shifting and irritation, tugging at what pressed it too hard. Ancient storytellers described these signs as the world withdrawing its ease, as though the land grew weary of being constantly reshaped. Human fear thickened. Some sought refuge in prayer, asking heaven to intervene. Others imitated their rulers, adopting cruelty to survive within the new order. Violence crept into daily life not through war but through small choices. A harsh judgment here, a withheld kindness there. Justice lost its center, mercy dimmed. The Nephilim noticed these changes but misread them entirely. To those who lived centuries, fear looked indistinguishable from reverence. Resentment felt like awe. Silence resembled obedience. and in this misinterpretation their dominion hardened further. Still, heaven did not descend with lightning. According to later traditions, messengers were sent in quietness, not to command but to remind. Boundaries still mattered, even for the mighty. Separation still held meaning. Power was never permission without measure. Some Nephilim felt a tremor of unease upon hearing such words and withdrew to ponder them. Others dismissed the warnings as relics of an age too timid to grasp destiny. This divide carved the first true fault line among the giants. Humanity did not yet understand the significance, but the world did. A fracture in motive, a tension in vision, power without agreement turning subtly inward. And once such a fracture begins, it grows. It grows in silence, in pride, in the conviction that strength is its own justification. A crown too heavy for any head, yet still worn, became the symbol of this era. Not a single crown made of metal, but a metaphorical one, the burden of rule embraced without understanding. And in that weight, the first threads of the final war quietly took hold. Dominion deepened in ways that few could name, though all could feel. What began as influence had hardened into structure. Councils once filled with debate grew quieter. Decisions that once required many voices now rested on the measured nod of a single towering figure. Human elders, once custodians of memory and law, found their words treated as suggestions rather than anchors. And though no decree announced the change, the world moved as if it had accepted a new center of gravity. The Nephilim did not seize control, they became control. Their presence filled every threshold. Where they walked, roads widened. Where they rested, settlements gathered. Where they judged, silence followed. This was not a rule enforced by threat but by assumption. They lived so long, saw so much, endured so easily that humanity began to believe their dominance was destiny. Children grew up knowing no other shape of power. Elders taught the old ways with trembling voices, wondering if their wisdom still had a place. Yet beneath the upward order, the world pulsed with unrest. Fields that once nourished generations now yielded harvests that felt strangely reluctant. Crops grew unevenly, lush in one corner, barren in another. Rivers rose at odd times, washing over their banks as if shrugging away the walls and channels the giants had carved. Storms circled mountains without entering, as though resisting the shadows cast by those who lived upon them. Some traditions say creation itself was whispering, "Enough." But this whisper did not reach the ears of most Nephilim. To beings who measured time in centuries, fluctuations felt trivial. If a river flooded, they raised its banks. If a field failed, they cleared new land. If storms shifted, they took it as challenge. Their strength had solved every problem they encountered, therefore strength must be the answer again. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Within the hearts of humans, resentment began to simmer. Fear had been bearable. Dependence had been convenient. But the loss of dignity, the sense that there will no longer mattered, carved wounds no season could heal. Some prayed harder than ever, seeking deliverance from a weight they could not name but deeply felt. Others sought to imitate their rulers, mirroring cruelty in hopes of surviving under it. Violence seeped into everyday life quietly, like a dark current beneath a calm river. The Nephilim misread every sign. When humans lowered their eyes, the giants saw respect. When people grew quieter, they interpreted it as reverence. When small acts of imitation emerged, they saw them as confirmation that their leadership was shaping humanity for the better. Never once did they consider that fear and admiration could look the same. Still, heaven remained distant. No storms of judgment, no thundering voice. Only quiet reminders carried through messengers, warnings delivered with gentleness, not force. Later writings describe these reminders as echoes of ancient law, separation, limit, measure. But the Nephilim had grown accustomed to a world that yielded beneath their will, and warnings without consequences felt like old stories spoken to children. A few giants trembled at the reminders. They felt the world's unease, sensed the strain in the soil, saw the dimming of stars on certain nights. These withdrew into contemplation, stepping away from the councils, leaving humans confused and the bolder giants irritated. But their voices faded beneath the growing certainty of their brethren. This certainty carried a dangerous illusion. If they had become the unchallenged rulers of the world, then surely the world itself approved. In this illusion, dominion became doctrine. It was no longer enough to guide. They believed they were meant to define, not enough to protect. They sought to direct fate itself. And humanity, standing beneath this rising tide of ambition, felt the ground shift in ways that could not be reversed. The divide among the Nephilim widened. Some felt burdened by the crown too heavy for any being to bear. Others embraced it with pride. This fracture, subtle but sharp, marked the beginning of something irreversible. Power without unity always folds inward, and when giants fracture, the world feels the break. By now, the land's resistance had grown steady. Not catastrophic, but persistent. Every harvest spoke a warning. Every restless migration whispered truth. Every altered river echoed imbalance. A question lingered, unspoken, but everywhere. What happens when dominion becomes too heavy for the world to hold? The age of dominion entered its heaviest phase in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of pressure, like the air before a distant storm or the quiet of deep water. Humanity lived within this weight without knowing how to describe it. The Nephilim moved through it without recognizing its warning, and the world endured it because it had no choice. Life continued, outwardly unchanged. Cities bustled, markets opened. Children learned trades and recited the names of rulers, but beneath the surface something essential had shifted. The rhythm of the age no longer beat in harmony with creation. It pulsed instead with the will of the mighty, and creation, subtle but steadfast, began to respond. Rivers altered their moods. One season they swelled without rain, the next they shrank without drought. Wind carved new paths across fields, as if refusing to follow old routes shaped by giants. Trees shed leaves out of season. Even birds began avoiding certain regions, circling wide arcs as though pushed by an invisible boundary. To humans, these signs felt ominous. To the Nephilim, they were irritations. Strength had become their interpretation of truth. And so, when the world trembled beneath their steps, they believed the tremor belonged to them, even when it did not. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The internal fracture among the Nephilim widened into open tension. Those who sensed the world's unease yield quieter, withdrawing from councils, speaking only in gentle caution. They felt that something ancient was stirring in the foundations of creation. They did not know what form judgment would take, but they sensed its inevitability. Others, those who saw themselves as the rightful rulers of earth, dismissed the warnings with contempt. To them, the hesitant ones were weak, bound by fear of old traditions. What need was there for restraint when destiny had already chosen them? What meaning could separation hold when strength had blurred the lines between heaven and earth? This disagreement did not erupt into battle. It simply changed the atmosphere of every gathering. A glance held too long, a silence that spoke too much, a judgment passed without consultation. Power, once unified, now tilted between competing certainties. Humanity stood between these tightening forces. Some feared the tension, sensing violence in the future. Others clung to the dominant giants, believing their certainty offered protection. But most simply endured, not knowing that history had already begun turning toward an end none of them could imagine. During this time, heaven's messengers continued their quiet reminders. These were not threats. They were echoes of law spoken gently, almost sorrowfully. Boundaries matter. Separation exists for a reason. Power is not its own permission. But the world had entered a stage where reminders no longer shaped outcomes. The Nephilim who embraced dominion believed the messengers irrelevant, voices of a weaker era clinging to outdated caution. They wore their authority like a crown, even as its weight pressed into their spirits. A crown too heavy for any head, yet still worn. Meanwhile, the land beneath them grew more rigid. Soil compacted. Rivers hesitated before turning. Animals grew restless at night. Even the sky dimmed slightly in certain seasons, a thin haze softening the stars. These were the soft steps of consequence approaching, not yet visible but undeniable for those who listened. Human stories from this era carry a strange mixture of awe and dread. Songs praised the giants, yet children whispered tales of nights when the ground moaned softly under unseen strain. Elders spoke of ancient warnings, how imbalance always calls for correction, how power without measure invites return. But few understood how close that return had come. Dominion had reached its peak, and in reaching its peak, it had revealed its flaw. A world governed by a strength that refused to recognize limits cannot remain stable. A creation pushed too hard begins to bend, and bending becomes breaking when pressure remains unrelieved. The giants believed themselves unshakable. Humanity believed itself trapped. The earth believed itself burdened. And heaven, still silent, watched as the fracture widened toward its inevitable consequence. Nothing spectacular marked the end of the age. No trumpet, no upheaval, no sign that history had turned a corner. Only a question rising from the quiet places of the world, carried in wind, whispered in roots, held in the weight of the sky. How long can a crown be worn before the head beneath it begins to break? In that unanswered question, the age of dominion closed, softly, steadily, and entirely. And what followed would draw the world toward its first unmistakable step into the final war's shadow. There are ages in which power stands tall, unified, unquestioned. And then there are ages when even the mighty begin to fracture, not because their strength has waned, but because their visions have diverged. This chapter enters the moment when the Nephilim, once bound by origin, no longer moved with a single purpose. Their unity, which had held firm for generations, began to thin like old fabric pulled too tightly. In the beginning of this fracture, the world grew strangely quiet, as though listening for what would follow. Ancient traditions insist the Nephilim were never truly one will. They shared lineage, strength, and the strange burden of long life, but they did not share desire. Some remembered the first intention of their existence, to dwell upon the earth without devouring it, to stand as beings of convergence rather than consumption. These giants carried memories older than cities, and within those memories flickered remnants of humility. Others saw such restraint as weakness. They believed vitality was proof of destiny, strength was evidence of mandate, and the earth's malleability was permission to reshape it. To them, hesitation was an insult to their nature. Why hold back when the world bent beneath their hands? Why honor limits that seemed designed for beings far smaller? This disagreement began softly. A withheld answer here, a silent glance there, but slow tensions, once ignored, hardened into dividing lines. Across their domains, fortresses closed their gates, not against humans but against fellow giants. Places once open for shared training now grew cold. No more laughter echoed through mountain passes. Instead, Nephilim watched one another from opposite ridges, measuring strength, testing resolve through silence alone. Humanity, smaller and more fragile, felt this tension immediately. Loyalties were no longer optional. Every village became associated with a faction. Every valley carried the shadow of one giant or another. Neutrality, once a refuge, disappeared. But this was only the beginning. For the first time, traditions speak of true violence between giants, not wars meant to annihilate, but displays designed to intimidate. A mountain cracked along its spine after a single blow, its peak spilling stone into the valleys below. A riverbed trembled as two enormous figures clashed with open hands, sending tremors across far-off settlements. A region of forest blackened overnight, not burned intentionally, but crushed beneath the weight of a demonstration. These moments were remembered not for the giant's fury but for the earth's reaction, as if the land itself recoiled. Heaven remained silent, which only deepened the fracture. To some Nephilim, this silence meant freedom. No correction, no intervention. To others, it carried a warning. Judgment withheld is not judgment canceled. Ancient writers suggest the silence allowed consequence to mature fully. Every action, every step was being weighed. Human stories from this era grew stranger. Children whispered dreams in which the sky closed like a door. Elders spoke of visions where light withdrew behind invisible walls as if something sacred had stepped backward. These were not prophecies of destruction, but hints of separation, heaven distancing itself from the disorder below. And in the center of one abandoned council hall lay a stone, once the gathering place of Nephilim agreement, now split down the middle. A council stone shattered, never repaired. None claimed responsibility. None dared touch it. The break reflected more than stone. It mirrored the giants themselves. By the end of this period, the final war had transformed from distant possibility to unspoken certainty. A storm not yet visible but felt. A path not yet walked but inevitable. The question lingering across the land was no longer if judgment would come, but what shape it would take, and whether any being left on earth would recognize its approach in time. The fracture among the Nephilim deepened in patterns more subtle and more dangerous than open war. This was an age shaped not by armies but by distrust, a quiet turning of shoulders, a distance measured in silence. Even the wind seemed to shift direction depending on whose domain it crossed, as though creation itself sensed loyalty splintering. At first, these divisions formed like thin cracks along a stone surface, small, delicate, easily overlooked. A Nephilim refusing to join a council gathering. Another leaving before discussion ended. A third choosing to train alone at twilight rather than under the sun with their brethren. None of these actions appeared significant on their own, but together they marked a shift, one that grew heavier with each passing season. This was the moment when the giants began to question one another's intentions more than humanity's. Suspicion, once foreign to them, became familiar. They watched each other's movements. They tracked unfamiliar sounds echoing across the mountains. They studied footprints left in the dust, not to identify strangers, but to determine which of their own had passed through. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The world, already strained by the weight of dominion, now bore the pressure of divided motive. Creation can withstand great strength, but it struggles under disunity. The tremors that once accompanied demonstrations of power now arrived unpredictably, sparked by tension rather than impact. Valleys quivered at dusk. Cliffs shed stone without touch. Rivers altered their current as if avoiding conflict. Humans, always sensitive to the invisible, felt the shift in their bones. Regions aligned themselves under different Nephilim lords, though alignment was too gentle a word. It was submission, survival. Entire communities changed their customs based on which giant watched from the ridge above. One village imposed curfews at sunset because its protector grew irritated by noise. Another enforced ritual silence at dawn because the giant in the north preferred to hear the land's breathing uninterrupted. In trying to endure, humanity became unwilling participants in the giant's growing divide. The first open displays of violence between Nephilim emerged during this time. Tradition describes them not as battles meant to kill, but as proofs of dominance. Thunder without lightning, force without mercy. A giant striking the ground to send a message miles away. A ridge split in half to warn arrival. When two giants met in open confrontation, the earth bore the wounds more deeply than they did. Mountains cracked in straight lines, as if drawn by envy. Sibyl blades. Valleys filled with ash from forests crushed in clashes too immense for human comprehension. These events were remembered less for spectacle and more for a strange sadness that followed them. The way birds refused to return, the way water pooled in shapes that resembled scars. Heaven remained silent still. To the boldest Nephilim, this silence reinforced their beliefs. If their actions were forbidden, surely the heavens would intervene. But nothing descended. No correction arrived. And in that silence, arrogance deepened. Other giants read the stillness differently. They sensed a withdrawal, a distancing of the sacred. Separation was not absence but restraint, a sign that law was allowing the consequences of imbalance to fully ripen. Yet nothing frightened them more than the dreams. Across humanity, and even among some Nephilim, stories spread of nights where the sky appeared to close, not through cloud or darkness, but as though a great door had been drawn slowly shut. Light dimmed behind something unseen. The world felt smaller, more enclosed. In these dreams, voices did not speak warnings. They simply faded. Humans whispered these dreams to one another in fear. Giants kept them silent, unsure whether sharing them would be seen as vulnerability. In an abandoned high hall, the shattered council stone remained untouched. It had once been the heart of unity, the place where Nephilim had joined their strength, counsel, and purpose. Now it lay broken, its two halves pulled slightly apart by time, as if even the stone wished to distance itself from the weight it once bore. The giants passed it without meeting its gaze. Every world-changing age has a moment when the future turns. In this era, that moment was not explosive. It was subtle, a shift in posture, a change in breath. A line crossed softly without thunder. It was the moment when giants stopped fearing the consequences of division, and creation, in its quiet wisdom, began preparing for what must follow. And in that tightening silence, a question formed like mist above a river. How long can a fractured foundation hold before it finally gives way? The fractures among the giants reached a stage where silence carried more danger than shouting. It was an era defined not by the loudness of conflict, but by the weight of everything unspoken. The Nephilim, once towering symbols of unity, strength, and purpose, now stood like great stones cracked from within. Each one bore its own vision of the world, its own interpretation of destiny, its own fear of what lay ahead. And fear, when held by beings of immense strength, changes the shape of history. Across the ancient world, landscapes began to reflect the divide that ran through the Nephilim. Where once their presence had created order, now their distance created instability. A fortress perched on a mountain ridge locked its gates not against human threat, but against a former ally. Watchfires burned every night, not to guide travelers, but to keep watch on the direction from which another giant might appear. Though they rarely spoke of it, each Nephilim sensed that the world was growing heavier, as though creation itself were thickening around them. When they walked, the ground seemed less willing to bear their weight. When they looked to the horizon, the sky felt more distant, as if withdrawing behind a veil. When they tried to hear the deep murmurs of the earth, murmurs they once trusted, they heard only static. Something sacred was pulling away, yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The giants who believed in restraint felt the withdrawal most acutely. They stood in the high places, cliffs, ridges, old meeting sites, trying to listen for the familiar resonance of heaven's nearness. But instead, they felt a thinning connection, as if the bond between realms had been stretched beyond what it was meant to endure. Meanwhile, the more ambitious giants interpreted the same silence as an open path. If heaven no longer spoke, perhaps heaven no longer cared. If no voice forbade them, perhaps no law bound them. Their confidence hardened into conviction, and their conviction began shaping the fate of entire regions. Even humanity could sense the divide. Families living in valleys between rival Nephilim territories whispered of nights when the air vibrated faintly, as though two unseen storms pressed against one another. Traders avoided certain roads where the atmosphere felt wrong, too thick, too heavy, as if the land itself expected a blow. And then came the demonstrations. Not wars, not annihilation, tests, warnings, showings of dominance meant for rival eyes. A mountain peak sheared off in a single strike. A deep canyon widened overnight as the ground split under titanic force. A lake drained mysteriously, its waters forced aside by pressure no human could comprehend. These displays injured the world more than the giants themselves. Animals fled entire regions. Trees grew twisted near the sites, leaning as though cowering. Even the wind hesitated when passing over newly broken terrain. Humans told stories in those days, stories not of giants' violence but of the world's grief. But heaven remained silent. To some Nephilim, this silence felt like permission. To others it felt like sorrow, but to ancient writers the truth lay somewhere deeper. Law was allowing consequences to ripen to their full weight so that no being, giant or human, could claim ignorance when the reckoning finally came. The dreams intensified. Men and women across distant settlements reported visions where the sky folded in on itself like a great door slowly swinging shut. Light did not vanish, it retreated. Voices did not warn, they fell quiet. There was no fire, no trumpet, only a sense that the sacred was drawing away, making room for something inevitable. Some Nephilim experienced these dreams too, though few admitted it. They woke with a heaviness in their limbs, a tightness in their breath. They felt watched not by heaven but by consequence. And always at the center of these visions lay a broken image, a council stone shattered down the middle, a symbol of unity never repaired. By the end of this era, the final war had already formed, not in battlefields but in certainty. The land felt it, humanity felt it. Even the giants felt it, though they refused to name it. Judgment was no longer hypothetical. It was a presence approaching, slow as dusk, steady as tide. The question remaining silent, pressing, was simple. Would anyone recognize the shape of judgment before it arrived? And in the soft stillness of an unbroken night, the world waited, knowing the next shift would carry it toward a destiny from which no realm, heaven or earth, would remain untouched. There are moments in ancient history when those meant to guide become silent. Not in anger, not in judgment, but in sorrow so deep it cannot speak. In such moments, the world grows hollow at the edges. Light feels thinner. Breath feels slower. And those who once stood close to heaven begin to feel the weight of distance. This is the era in which the Watchers, burdened with foresight, stepped back, and the earth felt the absence like a fading star. Later traditions speak with care when describing this period. The Watchers, beings of insight, oversight, and boundary keeping, were not portrayed as monsters, nor as heroes. They were beings caught in the tension between what they desired and what they should have guarded. Some crossed boundaries out of longing for understanding, others out of compassion, a few perhaps out of simple curiosity. And yet, regardless of motive, their choices contributed to a chain of consequence that neither they nor the world could control. When fractures among the Nephilim deepened and dominion grew heavy upon the land, the Watchers felt the shift first. Their hearts, attuned to the laws woven into creation, sensed the imbalance spreading like cracks beneath the soil. They saw what humanity could not yet see and what the Nephilim refused to acknowledge. The world was approaching a point where consequence would no longer wait. Their first response was withdrawal, not an act of cowardice but of restraint, an attempt to stop feeding the imbalance. They ceased teaching. They stepped away from counsel. They withheld the knowledge they once offered freely. And in doing so, they hoped that absence might accomplish what presence had failed to do, awaken caution. But absence is rarely interpreted correctly. Humanity felt the loss acutely. Skills once passed from teacher to student faded within a generation. Rituals forgot. Practices that had balanced communities fell into disuse. Knowledge that once flowed easily now dimmed like an oil lamp left untended. The silence, meant to correct, instead resembled abandonment. Among the Watchers themselves, division grew. Some argued that withdrawal was not enough, that consequence once set in motion could not be halted by retreat. They believed judgment would not restore what had been broken. It would not bring clarity, it would erase complexity. They saw the coming storm and trembled, not from fear for themselves, but from sorrow for all creation would lose. Their regret deepened the tragedy of the age, for they had seen this path forming long before the first fracture appeared among the giants. They had felt the tension in the laws they strained. They had recognized the danger of crossing boundaries designed to protect both realms, and though they had foreseen the outcome, they failed to prevent it. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Nephilim misinterpreted the Watchers' retreat. To some giants, the quiet departure confirmed what they had already begun to believe: independence. If heaven would not correct them, then heaven must have relinquished authority. Strength, therefore, was not merely power, it was destiny. Dominion would be secured by force alone. To others, the silence felt like betray. If the Watchers had once guided them, why withdraw now when the world trembled? If heaven cared, why remain distant? Their confusion hardened into resentment, and resentment shaped choices with long shadows. The world responded with quiet unease. Nights grew longer as though the earth rotated a fraction slower. Stars dimmed at their edges, not disappearing but losing a certain clarity. Air felt weighted, carrying a heaviness like the ache before rain. Travelers spoke of sound traveling differently, muffled, as though the sky itself had grown thick. Ancient storytellers described this era as one where even prayers moved slowly. Words felt delayed, uncertain where to land. Echoes returned weaker. Silence lasted longer. A lamp extinguished, not by wind but by choice, became the symbol of this time. A reminder that guidance withdrawn leaves more than darkness. It leaves questions without answers. And deep within that darkness, the world waited for what the silence would bring next. The withdrawal of the Watchers changed the very texture of the age. Their presence, once subtle but steady, had been woven into the rhythms of the world for generations. When they stepped back, something intangible loosened. As though a supporting beam, long unnoticed, had been quietly removed from beneath the structure of creation. The world did not collapse, but it leaned. And everyone, from the smallest child to the mightiest Nephilim, felt that lean in ways they could not understand. At first, the change showed itself in the small places. A field that no longer responded to the rituals taught by the Watchers centuries earlier. A stream whose clarity dulled, as if reflecting less of the sky. A child's prayer that once brought comfort now echoing strangely in the heart, neither landing nor lifting. These signs were gentle but persistent. They whispered the truth. Guidance had thinned not by force but by intention. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Among the Watchers, the weight of regret had settled like a low, unending storm. They watched from distances unseen, witnessing consequences unfold with painful clarity. They had hoped that silence would stir caution, that their absence would awaken humility, that the giants, feeling the world shift beneath them, might reconsider their path. But regret, however deep, does not rewrite what has already been done. Some Watchers argued among themselves that stepping back might hasten the world's descent rather than prevent it. They believed the imbalance had grown too great, and that punishment, once unleashed, would not differentiate between corruption and complexity. The world would not be corrected, it would be reset. This fear, preserved in fragments of ancient writings, became a wound they carried in silence. Humanity misread the Watchers' absence as well. Many believed heaven had turned its face away. That wisdom, once generously poured out, had been taken back. Elders tried to preserve what teachings they remembered, but without guidance, even memory grew uncertain. The world felt colder. Rituals lost meaning. Skills faded. And hope dimmed like an ember starved of breath. The Nephilim's interpretation, however, proved most consequential. For the giants who craved dominance, the silence of heaven was confirmation. They saw themselves as the natural inheritors of the world, its rulers, its judges, its architects. If heaven had withdrawn, then heaven had forfeited authority. And if authority had passed, then the giants would seize it fully. Dominion hardened into destiny. Other Nephilim, those who felt the weight of restraint, interpreted the silence with dread. They sensed the distance not as permission, but as warning. Something sacred was pulling away, preparing for a consequence that would not be negotiated. These giants grew quieter, more hesitant, watching the land for signs the way a healer studies a fading pulse. But their caution did not prevent the growing tension between their kin. The fracture widened, fed by misunderstanding, pride, and the absence of guidance. The world itself mirrored their instability. Nights lengthened beyond expectation, stretching like shadows drawn too far. Stars dimmed, not fading but withdrawing, as if hesitant to bear witness. The air grew heavier, carrying a strange drag, as if sound itself resisted movement. Even the wind changed its voice, losing the clear tone of earlier ages. Travelers told stories of walking across valleys where their footsteps seemed swallowed. Shepherds spoke of hearing distant calls arrive a heartbeat too late. Mothers whispered that their children's dreams had turned colder, filled with doors that closed silently, leaving them standing on the wrong side. Ancient storytellers said that prayers during this age felt delayed, as though the sky itself were thick with distance. Words, once carried effortlessly upward, now drifted without direction, searching for a place to land. A lamp extinguished, not by wind but by choice, became the defining image of this era, for the watchers had not been forced away. They had withdrawn deliberately, choosing silence over intervention, not as punishment, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement that the world had reached a point where guidance would no longer guide. Stillness replaced instruction, regret replaced purpose, and the earth, sensing the shift, braced itself for the consequence that silence was preparing. In this dimming age, a question lingered, soft, mournful. If those meant to guide no longer speak, who will carry wisdom through the gathering storm? As the silence of the watchers deepened, a new atmosphere settled over the ancient world, an atmosphere not of sudden catastrophe, but of slow, pervasive withdrawal. It was the feeling of a great door almost closed, a breath half drawn, the sense that something once near had stepped back just beyond reach. The heavens had not turned violent, they had turned distant. And that distance changed everything. Humanity felt it first in their daily lives. The elders who relied on inherited teachings found that certain practices no longer worked as they once had. Blessings once spoken over crops yielded little effect. Songs that had soothed storms now seemed to dissolve into the air with no response. The rituals that had been passed down for generations no longer carried the same resonance. It was as if the channels between heaven and earth had thinned, trembling under the weight of strain. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Watchers, those beings bound to oversight, remembrance, and boundaries, watched from afar as the world moved toward a precipice. Their regret was not a momentary ache. It was a burden that settled into the marrow of their existence. They had crossed into realms they were never meant to shape, guiding humanity and the Nephilim in ways that bent the intended order. Now, in stepping back, they bore witness to the unraveling of consequences they themselves had set in motion. Some Watchers longed to intervene again, not with force but with counsel. They yearned to restore what had begun to break. Yet they understood too clearly that intervention at this stage would not correct the course. It would only mask the underlying fracture. The laws older than themselves had been stretched, and those laws were beginning to recoil. Others argued, quietly and bitterly, that judgment would sweep away more than corruption. It would sweep away nuance, history, relationship. That the coming consequence, whatever form it took, would not distinguish the guilty from the complicated. Their sorrow was profound, for they saw that repentance and regret could not mend what had already entered a state of collapse. Meanwhile, the Nephilim watched the heavens with their own interpretations. For the proudest among them, the Watchers, silence felt like relinquishment. If heaven no longer advised, then the giants believed themselves free to define the order of the world. Their ambitions sharpened, their confidence hardened. With guidance gone, they filled the void with their own visions fueled by strength, longevity, and the certainty that they were the world's rightful stewards. For others, the silence felt suffocating. These giants sensed the thinning connection and trembled. They understood that when the sacred withdraws, consequence approaches. They felt the world tightening beneath their feet. They watched the stars dim slightly, not from cloud but from distance. They felt something wholly pulling away, sealing itself behind invisible veils. In this age of regret and misunderstanding, the world transformed subtly but unmistakably. Nights lengthened, not dramatically, but perceptibly, as though time itself hesitated between dusk and dawn. Stars flickered faintly at their edges. Wind carried a muted tone, as if traveling through thicker air. Birds altered migration paths, avoiding regions where the spiritual atmosphere felt heavy. Travelers spoke of nights when the sky seemed lower. Villagers whispered of prayers that felt as though they were being pushed back down instead of rising. Children described dreams where light withdrew behind unseen walls. Ancient storytellers recorded these sensations with a simple phrase: the heavens were stepping away. This withdrawal was not punishment, it was preparation. Preparation for a separation long delayed. Preparation for a consequence long earned. Preparation for a sealing of realms that had mingled too freely, too dangerously, for too long. The Watchers knew this. Their regret lay precisely in this knowledge, that reconciliation was no longer possible. Their sorrow did not undo the laws they had strained. It only illuminated how irreversible the coming judgment had become. A lamp extinguished, not by wind, not by force, but by choice, became the defining symbol of their grief. It marked the moment when guidance ended, not because heaven was careless, but because the world had crossed a threshold where guidance could no longer serve its purpose. In the hush of that dimming age, the world braced itself. The Nephilim stood divided, some hardened by autonomy, others trembling under foresight. Humanity clung to hope without knowing what shape hope could take, and the Watchers, withdrawn but watching, felt the world slide toward its destined reckoning. The silence grew deeper, the air grew heavier, and creation waited for the next turning. In that stillness, one question lingered in every realm: what happens when those meant to watch can only witness? And as the night stretched quietly across the land, the answer drew nearer, carried on a current the giants could not stop and the Watchers could no longer alter. There are moments in history when the smallest lives carry the greatest weight, when the footsteps of the mighty shake the mountains, yet the trembling of a single human heart echoes louder in the halls of heaven. In such seasons, the world does not turn because of those who rule it, but because of those who endure within it. This is the age when humanity, fragile, frightened, and fading at the edges, stood at a threshold it could not name, yet felt in every breath. Humanity lived beneath the looming shadows of giants and the fading silence of the Watchers. The great beings debated power, boundaries, dominion, and consequence. But humans, the farmers, shepherds, builders, singers, healers, lived inside the storm these arguments created. Ancient traditions insist they were not merely victims drifting helplessly in the wake of cosmic decisions. They adapted. They learned. They hardened where survival demanded it. Fear has a way of reshaping values. Communities once bound by trust grew guarded. Villages that once taught hospitality began closing their gates at night. Parents warned children not of wild beasts, but of the footsteps of those who walked with long shadows. Violence, once rare and shocking, became woven into daily life, an unspoken currency of survival. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Within this darkening age, small resistances emerged like embers refusing to die. Families who bowed to no giant, even when the cost was suffering. Groups who protected strangers despite the risks. Communities who shared food during scarcity instead of hoarding it. Acts of mercy in a world leaning toward cruelty. These gestures did not alter the path of history. They did not stop the giants' rise or soften the Watchers' withdrawal. But they preserved something fragile and sacred: witness. The living memory that compassion still existed, even when overshadowed by enormous forces. In ancient texts, these small resistances are remembered not as victories, but as quiet lanterns carried through a gathering storm. Human prayers reflected the strain of this age. They grew simpler, less confident, not requests for triumph or vengeance, but for remembrance. See us, know us, do not let us vanish. Such prayers were shaped not by pride, but by a longing to matter in a world dominated by powers far beyond human comprehension. The Nephilim noticed this shift in humanity but misinterpreted it completely. To some, human desperation looked like surrender. They believed humanity had accepted its place beneath them. Others took advantage of this vulnerability, demanding what had never been theirs to take: worship, submission of soul rather than body. a blurring of the line between created and creator. This was a boundary older than any written law, a boundary woven into the structure of reality itself. And when giants crossed it, ancient storytellers say the weight fell heavily in the scales of heaven's judgment. Nature itself began to echo humanity's distress. Crops failed in uneven patches, one field yielding abundantly while the neighboring one withered to dust. Storms arrived without pattern, striking regions unprepared. Rain fell where drought was needed, drought settled where water once flowed. The land seemed to resist the control imposed upon it, fracturing into pockets of scarcity and strange abundance. These were not random misfortunes. They were symptoms, the world straining under incompatible claims, trying to correct what had grown imbalanced. By this time, the final war was no longer a distant threat. It did not appear as armies on opposing hillsides or banners in the wind. It manifested as unraveling, moral, spiritual, natural. A world stretched across too many claims of power, too many voices calling themselves rightful stewards, too many forces pulling creation in opposing directions. Heaven had not yet acted, but restraint stretched thin, like a rope beginning to fray. Judgment had not arrived, but its shape had formed. Everything waited for the moment when law would no longer yield. And in that suspended breath of history, a single human act became the chapter's signature. Someone spoke a prayer aloud, unanswered, yet remembered. A whisper carried into a sky growing distant, yet still listening. Humanity's place in this age was neither central nor insignificant. They lived in the margins of a story shaped by giants and watched by the fading silence of heaven, but it was in those margins that the world's emotional truth unfolded. The giants contended with dominion and the watchers with regret, but humanity contended with survival, dignity, and memory. Across the land, villages existed like small islands in a rising tide. Some were overshadowed by Nephilim who demanded allegiance. Others stood on contested ground between rival giants. Everywhere, people walked carefully, measuring their words, guarding their gestures, carrying their fears close to their chests. But even in such conditions, humanity did what it has always done. It adapted. Parents taught their children to move quietly when the earth trembled. Herdsmen learned to read wind shifts that foretold a giant approaching. Communities developed subtle signals, simple sounds or movements to warn each other of danger. The world had become unpredictable and humans survived by becoming attentive. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Survival did not merely sharpen instincts, it changed values. As fear tightened its grip, the boundaries between right and necessary began to blur. Theft rose not out of greed but hunger. Conflicts erupted not out of hatred but desperation. Violence became ordinary. In some places, cruelty was adopted as a shield, a way of imitating the giants as though mirroring their harshness might offer protection. Ancient traditions do not excuse these changes, but they understand them. Fear teaches obedience. Oppression teaches imitation. A long enough shadow reshapes what grows beneath it, but not all humanity bent toward darkness. Scattered throughout this troubled age were pockets of resistance, small, quiet, precious. A family that refused to surrender their neighbor to a giant's demand. A village that chose mercy despite scarcity. A wanderer who taught forgotten songs beneath the cover of night. These acts were fragile, but they mattered. They kept alive the thread of identity the age threatened to erase. In the writings of the elders, these actions were called witnesses, testimonies that humanity had not entirely become what fear would mold it into. In a world shaped by extremes of power, such gestures were seeds of remembrance. Human prayers reflected the uncertainty of the age. They were no longer adorned with poetic flourishes or confident declarations. They became concise, trembling, urgent. Remember us. Do not forget. Let our lives matter. These prayers were not about triumph. They were about existence itself. And prayers, even desperate ones, changed the atmosphere. The Nephilim noticed humanity's shift but interpreted it through their own fractured perspective. Those who sought dominance saw the change as submission, a sign that humanity recognized their rightful authority. They did not see the despair behind the eyes of those who bowed. Others, more corrupted by ambition, saw the vulnerability as an opportunity for worship. Not loyalty, worship. An allegiance that reached into the soul. This crossed a boundary that even creation recognized as sacred. Ancient storytellers warn that no being born of earth, giant or human, may claim devotion meant only for what is beyond creation. That confusion of roles weighed heavily in the balance of judgment. Nature echoed the unraveling. Crops responded erratically. In one region, fields bloomed with abundance despite poor soil. In another, fertile land produced nothing but withered stalks. Storms arrived without warning, bending trees in violent spirals. Winds reversed their seasonal patterns. The land itself seemed to resist the attempts of any being, giant or human, to impose centralized control. To many, it felt as though creation was withdrawing its cooperation. By this time, the final war was not a future possibility. It was an active condition, not yet expressed in battlefields or armies, but in the cracks spreading through the world's relationships, laws, and natural rhythms. Everything was pulling apart, unable to hold the weight of so many competing wills. Judgment had not yet fallen, but the rope of restraint had thinned to its last strands. In this darkening atmosphere, a single moment captured the spirit of the age. A person stood alone beneath a dim sky, whispered a prayer into the vast silence, received no answer, yet the world itself remembered the sound. A prayer spoken aloud, unanswered, yet held in the memory of creation. Humanity stood in a narrowing world, a world whose weight they could feel even if they could not name its cause. The giants were lost in their own tensions, the watchers had withdrawn in sorrow, and heaven itself seemed distant. Yet it was humanity who lived closest to the consequences. Every field, every home, every breath bore the tremors of forces they did not command. And still, the why endured. Daily life unfolded beneath this tightening sky with a strange mixture of fear and determination. Farmers rose before dawn to work soil that no longer behaved predictably. Some mornings it yielded normally, other mornings it resisted the plow like hardened clay. Shepherds guided their flocks along old routes, only to find that grass grew unevenly now, lush in one place, barren in another, as though the land itself had become uncertain of its loyalty. Families whispered at night not about stories or hopes but about survival. Would the giants demand tribute tomorrow? Would storms come unexpectedly again? Would the watchers return, or had heaven truly stepped away? No one had answers, but humanity continued because continuation was the only choice. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Within the human spirit, a subtle shift took place. The world was unraveling in ways too vast to comprehend, but this very unraveling awakened something ancient in the heart, the instinct to remember. When the center of life becomes unstable, people reach for something older than fear, identity. This was the threshold humanity stood upon. Acts of resistance grew not from rebellion, but from remembrance. A mother telling her children the old rituals even when they no longer worked. A healer practicing forgotten methods whispered through generations. A group of elders gathering in secret to sing songs of gratitude at dusk, not because the world was safe, but because gratitude itself was a way of staying human. These were small actions. They did not influence giants or shift heavenly decisions, but they created threads, thin, luminous, enduring, threads that kept humanity connected to itself while the world around them frayed. Human prayers, too, changed in tone. These were not the confident petitions of earlier ages. These were prayers weighted with humility, trembling with unspoken fear. They did not ask for power. They did not demand justice. They asked to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. Those prayers hung in the still air like fragile lanterns, dim, trembling, but alive. The Nephilim, steeped in their pride and preoccupied with their conflicts, misread these prayers completely. To the giants who embraced dominion, the desperation in humanity's voice sounded like surrender. To those who had grown more corrupt, that same desperation became a lure, a chance to demand what they had no right to claim: worship. This was a crossing more severe than any physical violence. When a being of earth seeks devotion meant only for the eternal, creation itself recoils. Ancient traditions speak cautiously here, suggesting that this moment weighed heavily in heaven's silence, not as shock, but as confirmation. A line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. The natural world responded almost immediately. Weather lost its rhythm entirely. Storms rolled across the land with no seasonal pattern. Rain appeared in narrow strips, leaving dry wastelands on either side. Lightning struck the same stone outcrop night after night as though marking a boundary unseen. The ground, usually faithful in its cycles, began to tremble more often, not violently but uneasily, like a body restless in sleep. Animals abandoned familiar territories. Birds migrated at odd times. Even insects shifted patterns, leaving certain regions strangely quiet. These were symptoms, not disasters. Signs that the balance sustaining the world had become strained to its final threads. By now, the final war was no longer a prophecy or a looming possibility. It was a condition already unfolding, not through armies or commands, but through unraveling, spiritual, natural, relational. Everything was pulling away from everything else. Heaven from earth, giants from giants, humans from the stability they once trusted. Judgment had not yet come, but its shadow had entered the world. All that remained was the moment when restraint, long held, long stretched, long tested, would give way to law. And in the final breath of this chapter's story, ancient memory preserves one fragile symbol: a single human voice, trembling yet defiant, lifted into a sky heavy with silence. A prayer spoken aloud, unanswered, yet remembered. For remembrance in ages such as this becomes the final anchor before the breaking. Before judgment takes shape, the universe pauses, not in silence but in alignment. In that pause, everything ancient rises to the surface: laws older than stars, principles woven before angels learned their names. These laws do not shout or threaten. They simply exist, steady and immovable. And when the world drifts too far from them, they begin to pull creation back into balance. This is the age when those ancient laws stirred, preparing to answer what strength and desire had undone. Ancient traditions make a careful distinction. Divine judgment is never described as reaction but as response, not impulse order, a return to alignment. Before heaven acted, the oldest foe, undations of creation, were consulted. These laws, according to the storytellers, predated the watchers and even the hosts of heaven. They were written into the structure of existence itself: separation, measure, return. They governed what realms could touch, how deeply power could reach, and what forms could endure without unraveling the world. For ages, these laws had been bent, pressed upon by the presence of the Nephilim, beings who existed at the edge of what the world could sustain. Their strength strained the boundaries meant to keep Earth steady. Their longevity bent the cycle of rise and fading meant for mortal life. But bending is not breaking, and for a time, creation absorbed the strain. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. When the Nephilim reached beyond influence into permanence, beyond presence into domination, they pushed against limits older than themselves. Their desire to remain unchanged, unchallenged, unending was not merely ambition. It was contradiction. The world was designed for balance, for cycles, for measured continuance. The giants sought to anchor themselves outside those cycles, to exist with a weight the earth was never crafted to bear. Reality began to show the consequences. Mountains shifted subtly, as though adjusting their foundations. Seas encroached upon coastlines not through storms, but through quiet, persistent rising. In some regions, time felt unstable, days stretching, nights compressing, seasons arriving early or late as if unsure of their order. Creation itself leaned under the pressure of beings who refused to conform to the laws that sustained existence. Heaven, perceiving the strain, did not respond with immediate force. Storytellers describe deliberation, though they warn that such language is metaphor. Human attempts to understand decisions made on scales beyond comprehension. They speak of weighing what could still be preserved, counting what threads of balance remained unbroken, measuring the cost of intervention. Judgment in this cosmic sense was not conceived as destruction. It was containment, a boundary being restored, a world being protected from collapse. The question behind the looming decision was not who deserves punishment, but what can continue without unraveling everything. Some Nephilim sensed this shift in the unseen order. They felt the laws tightening like a net around them, not as aggression but inevitability. A fear entered their councils, fear not of death, which they had always held distantly, but of erasure, to be undone, to vanish without echo, without legacy, severed from both heaven and earth. This dread pushed them toward escalation. If judgment was coming, then resistance felt like defiance, and defiance became the banner under which many stood. At this point, the final war crossed an unseen threshold. It ceased being a struggle for dominance and became something far more perilous, a challenge to the ancient laws themselves. The giants, intentionally or not, were attempting to reshape the structure of existence. And existence, bound by laws older than heaven, began preparing its answer. A scale, held perfectly level through ages of tension, finally felt the first subtle tilt. The laws older than heaven did not awaken with fury, they stirred with precision. Their movement was felt not in thunder or flame, but in subtle corrections, small shifts that revealed the world was beginning to tighten around truths too long ignored. These laws were not personal, not emotional. They were foundational, woven into the architecture of creation itself. And when creation strains, the laws that hold it together begin to pull inward, like a great tide returning to its source. Across the land, humanity noticed these shifts first. Not through grand visions, but through everyday distortions. A potter found that clay no longer responded to his hands with the same softness. A shepherd observed that shadows stretched in unusual directions, as though light itself was reconsidering its path. Travelers spoke of feeling time change its pace, moments slowing unexpectedly, while entire afternoons seemed to vanish in a blink. The Nephilim responded differently. Some laughed at these signs, dismissing them as inconveniences. To beings who had witnessed centuries, what weight carried a shifting wind or an unsettled night? Others paused. They felt a presence moving through the unseen layers of the world, not a being, but a rebalancing. A reminder that existence was governed by more than strength. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The laws of separation, measure, and return were beginning to tighten. Realms that had drifted too close began to pull apart. Energy stretched thin by overreach started to recoil. Structures warped by unnatural strain attempted to regain their original form. This was not judgment yet, it was alignment, the universe preparing itself for inevitable correction. The giants who founded their authority on Defiance felt this tightening most acutely. Their footsteps landed heavier, not because they had grown weaker, but because the ground was less willing to carry them. Their voices echoed strangely against the cliffs. Their councils grew tense, and conversations that once flowed with confidence now carried a tremble of suspicion. Among them, fear took a new shape. It was not fear of pain nor defeat. It was the dread of erasure, of being unmade, unwritten, forgotten by the world they had tried to reshape. The Nephilim had always lived close to the edge of the laws that govern creation. Now they sensed that the edge was drawing inward. In their desperation, they escalated. Some sought to seize more land, believing dominion could secure permanence. Others challenged rivals, hoping victory would restore their sense of control. A few tried to break the laws themselves, pushing against boundaries with acts so immense that the earth shuddered. These were not battles, they were declarations, silent cries against inevitability. Nature responded with increasing clarity. Mountains groaned softly but undeniably as though shifting their weight. Seas crept inland, swallowing shores under calm skies. Storms formed without wind. Lightning flickered above forests without thunder. In certain regions, time warped so unnaturally that elders spoke of days that felt thin, as though they lacked the fullness of reality. Humanity, too, felt the tightening lines of consequence. Children grew anxious without knowing why. Elders sensed a heaviness in their bones. People spoke of standing on a threshold, unable to return to the world they once knew. And still, heaven had not acted. This absence was not neglect, it was deliberation, the weighing of what remained salvageable, the counting of what threads could still be preserved. Judgment was taking shape, but not as vengeance, as necessity, as restoration. The ancient writers insisted that once the laws older than heaven begin to shift, reversal is no longer possible. These laws do not punish, they restore. They do not destroy, they recalibrate. And in the unseen chambers of creation, something waited, a scale held perfectly level through ages, now beginning its slow, deliberate tilt. A tilt that no strength could stop. A tilt signaling that the final war had crossed from possibility into inevitability. As the ancient laws tightened their grip, the world entered a phase that later generations would describe not as chaos, but as reversion, creation slowly pulling itself back toward the balance it had been forced to abandon. This was not yet divine intervention. It was not the hand of heaven reaching down. It was the world itself answering the pressure placed upon it, guided by laws too old to be ignored, too deep to be broken without cost. Even those who did not understand the signs could feel them. Farmers noticed that seeds planted in fertile soil sprouted unpredictably, as though the rhythm of growth had been disturbed. Some seeds burst prematurely, others lay dormant. Hunters found that animals had shifted migration paths entirely, moving along strange routes that ignored mountains, rivers, and seasons. Healers observed that illnesses changed their pace, some lingering too long, others passing too quickly. Everything behaved as if creation was trying to correct its own course. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The Nephilim, the beings who had stretched existence to its limits, felt the world turning against their presence. Not out of malice, but out of correction. Their bodies, so long accustomed to power, felt subtly heavier. Their voices echoed with a faint distortion, as if traveling through a world that no longer fully accepted them. Time, once a familiar companion, now moved strangely around them, either rushing past too quickly or slowing so much that their thoughts felt suspended. This was the fear that entered their councils, not the fear of death, but of erasure. To be undone, to be unremembered, to drift back into the silence from which they had come. For beings who had shaped cities, commanded nations, and believed themselves destined for permanence, this dread was unbearable, and dread became fuel for defiance. Some giants tried to seize the remaining stability of the world, expanding their territories in hopes that dominion could anchor them more firmly in existence. Others attempted to defy the laws directly, performing feats of strength and will that fractured hillsides and disrupted the earth's breath. Each attempt only worsened the imbalance. Every act of resistance accelerated the recalibration. Meanwhile, humanity sensed the shift in quieter ways. They felt moments collapse into one another or stretch too thin. They noticed birds refusing to fly across certain regions, as though invisible barriers had risen. Children dreamed of landscapes bending, folding, and reshaping. Elders felt old wounds ache as if memory itself were reacting to the strain. It was in this era that the ancient storytellers wrote their most solemn lines. When laws older than heaven begin to move, all things must reckon with their truth. Heaven's response remained measured, deliberate, waiting not for rebellion to cease, but for the world to reach the point where action was no longer optional. Judgment was not a weapon, but a restoration, and restoration arrives only when imbalance can no longer sustain itself. In the quiet realms beyond sight, the laws weighed all that had transpired. What could be preserved? What must return? What form could creation take without collapsing under contradiction? These questions shaped the slow, inevitable tilt of the cosmic scale. Ancient writings insist that this scale had remained perfectly level for ages, held steady by patience, mercy, and the hope that correction might come through restraint rather than intervention. But the Nephilim's challenge to limitation, their attempt to occupy a place outside the world's design, had driven the scale to its final threshold. And so, at last, the scale moved. Not violently, not suddenly, but with a slow, decisive shift. A tipping point reached not by wrath, but by necessity. A moment that transformed the final war from something building in shadows into something approaching in certainty. Judgment had not yet descended, but its path had begun to take shape, etched into the laws beneath creation, waiting now only for the moment when heaven's silence would lift. In that tense stillness, the world stood poised. Boundaries trembled, time warped, nature echoed the strain, and the Nephilim, caught between defiance and dread, felt the weight of inevitability settling upon them. The scale had tipped, the balance had spoken. And the next chapter would reveal what happens when ancient laws, long patient, finally call for return. There are moments when the world exhales after holding its breath for too long. Moments when tension, stretched across ages, finally releases, not as fury but as inevitability. In such moments, the earth does not roar, it sighs. The sky does not split, it loosens. And judgment arrives not as a weapon descending but as restraint lifting. This is the moment creation was waiting for, the moment when what had been held back was allowed to move freely again. Traditions speak with great care about the nature of the unleashing. They do not describe a blow or an invasion or a sudden divine strike. They describe a withdrawal, a releasing of pressure, a removal of the invisible hands that had been holding the world in delicate balance for far longer than any being realized. For ages, the laws older than heaven had stretched to accommodate the existence and ambitions of the Nephilim. Creation had bent, endured, adjusted. Boundaries had widened, thinned, and strained. But when the cosmic scale finally tipped, those ancient laws began to return the world to its proper shape. And the first sign of this return was movement, deep, quiet, unstoppable. Water rose. Not simply from rain or storm clouds, but from beneath the land, as if ancient springs long sealed had been released in unison. Wells overflowed, riverbeds swelled, underground reservoirs burst through rock. In some regions, the surface of the earth trembled as water surged upward, flooding plains without a single drop falling from the sky. The Nephilim, trained for physical conflict and visible threat, found themselves facing an enemy they could neither strike nor command. These waters were not armies, they were answers to centuries of imbalance. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Fortresses that had stood for generations, massive structures carved into mountainsides or anchored into deep stone, began to weaken, not through attack but through the soft undoing of foundations. Stones shifted, towers leaned, walls cracked. Entire strongholds collapsed suddenly, their bases dissolving as earth and water reclaimed what had been forced to bear unnatural weight. Strength, the Nephilim's greatest weapon, now failed them. Their mighty steps churned unstable ground. Their attempts to brace or hold massive structures fell apart as the very soil withdrew its support. They struck at nothing, no enemy, no force to overpower. Their power, so long unquestioned, met the one reality it could not challenge: inevitability. Some ancient traditions suggest that a few giants understood this truth in their final moments. That the unraveling they faced was not an act of aggression but a release, a return to balance, an ending not shaped by hatred but by necessity. Meanwhile, humanity endured once again as witnesses. They sheltered where they could, on hills, in small vessels, in hidden caverns whispered about in elder tales. Some survived by knowledge, others by luck, others by the simple fact that their scale, frail but appropriate, aligned with the world's original design. Their survival was not triumph. It was responsibility for the world that would emerge after the waters receded would be smaller, quieter, and dependent on the memory carried by those who remained. Heaven remained silent through the unleashing. Judgment does not pause to explain itself. It does not speak mid-course. Explanation arrives afterward in memory, teaching, and the quiet reflections of generations who inherit the new world. The unleashing continued, steady and relentless, as the old world surrendered to the weight of laws long ignored. And in one region, as water surged through a shattered valley, witnesses claimed to see something impossible, a door opening without a hand into nothing, yet into everything, a symbol that the age of restraint had ended and the age of return had begun. The unleashing did not arrive with spectacle, it arrived with certainty. Once the ancient restraints lifted, creation moved with the slow, unstoppable precision of law fulfilling itself. Nothing in the world fought back, not the mountains, not the seas, not the sky, for they were not being attacked, they were being restored. And restoration, once begun, does not ask permission. The first great shift came through water, but the second came through weakness, not of humanity, but of the structures the Nephilim had forged to stabilize their dominion. Towering fortresses, carved into cliffs or set atop ridges, began to tremble. Foundations cracked, not from external force, but because the earth no longer anchored them. The giants had built with the assumption that permanence could be constructed. Now creation revealed the truth. Nothing built outside the rhythm of balance could endure. A fortress that once took a century to complete fell in a single night. Stone by stone, level by level, until its weight returned to the ground that had always resisted bearing it. Nephilim tried to intervene. They pushed against collapsing walls with the full force of their strength. They yelled commands to earth and water, as though power itself could halt inevitability. They attempted to rescue one another from crumbling battlements, but every effort met the same unyielding response. The world no longer supported their presence, yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. This judgment did not pursue the giants, it withdrawn from them. It removed the cooperation of nature, the patience of the earth, the quiet restraint of heaven. Without those stabilizing forces, the Nephilim's power became irrelevant. They were creatures made possible by suspended laws, laws that had now resumed their course. Humanity, small enough in scale to still belong, endured in pockets of safety. They climbed to high ground, sheltered in caves, or traveled in small bands seeking elevation. Some followed instinct. Others followed ancestral stories of hidden places meant for refuge. No human strength could command the waters, but human fragility did not provoke resistance from the world. They fit within the returning measure. This survival, ancient storytellers insist, was not reward. It was continuity. For judgment does not select favorites. It preserves what can remain without fracturing creation. As waters rose from the deep, other forces joined the release. Time itself began to settle back into its original rhythm. The strange elongations and compressions of the previous age diminished. Seasons, though disrupted, moved toward coherence. The air changed as if shedding a great burden. Even sound shifted. Echoes once heavy became sharper, clearer, as if the world's breath had reset. The Nephilim, in their final resistance, attempted to gather in high places, believing height would grant safety. But the mountains, long strained by unnatural weight, began shedding their edges. Cliffs that had supported giant councils split like brittle clay. Plateaus sank. Rock faces peeled away under pressures the giants could no longer suppress. Some traditions whisper that a few giants looked to the sky in those last moments and understood the truth, that they were not being destroyed. They were being released. Their existence had stretched creation beyond its design. Judgment was not erasure born of anger, but return born of order. As the world convulsed and steadied, humanity watched from whatever shelter they could claim. They whispered prayers that were neither triumphant nor fearful, prayers simply asking to endure. Many believed heaven heard them, others believed heaven watched in silence, but all agreed on one truth: the world was changing into something none had known. And through it all, heaven gave no voice, no sign, no explanation. Judgment does not speak mid-course. It does not justify itself to those who must live through it. It unfolds as law, not argument. In the midst of this quiet rebalance, a phenomenon occurred in multiple places. People claimed to see doors, not structures, not openings in walls, but shapes in the air like shimmering veils, sliding open without touch. Some led to darkness, others to blinding light. None could be enter. They were symbols, not pathways, reminders that realms were resetting their boundaries. A door opening without a hand, an image that would haunt songs and stories for centuries. The unleashing reached its full breadth not through escalation but through completion. Judgment did not gather force like a storm building strength. It unfolded like a long-held breath finally released. By this stage, the world was no longer reacting. It was resetting. Everything that had once strained under imbalance now moved toward its intended measure. Humanity, scattered across high ground and islands of refuge, watched with a mixture of awe and trembling. They witnessed waters shifting in ways no lore had ever foretold, flowing upward through cracks in the earth, spilling across plains without wind or tide, carving new paths as though guided by memories older than the world they knew. They saw mountains reshape themselves, shedding ancient burdens. They felt the ground lighten underfoot as if relieved of a weight too long carried. The Nephilim, for all their might, faced only inevitability. Their strength met no opponent. Their cries echoed unanswered. Their presence, once central to the world, now clashed with the returning order. They were beings made possible by suspended boundaries, giants walking on borrowed time. And borrowed time, once due, returns all things to origin. Some roared in defiance, hurling boulders at collapsing cliffs and pounding the shifting ground with fists the size of pillars. Others fled toward the highest peaks, hoping elevation could grant reprieve. A few knelt, touching the trembling soil as though sensing a truth their kind had long denied. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. A small number of Nephilim, ancient traditions insist, felt clarity descend upon them in their final moments. As the ground weakened or waters surged toward them, they realized they were not being hunted. They were being released. Their existence had stretched creation to breaking. Judgment was not anger at their strength, but correction of their contradiction. These giants did not scream. They did not resist. They bowed their heads, acknowledging a truth older than their lineage. Nothing that stands outside balance can remain. Humanity, spared from this undoing not by merit but by alignment, found shelter where creation allowed it. Those who survived did so through humility, instinct, and the fragile scale of their existence. They fit within the returning equilibrium, small enough to adapt, light enough for the earth to carry. Their survival was not triumph, it was appointment. For the world that would emerge after the waters receded would require caretakers, beings who understood limitation, remembrance, and the cost of imbalance. During the culmination of the unleashing, heaven remained silent still. There were no declarations in the sky, no angels descending with scrolls, no divine speeches echoing across the waters. Judgment does not justify itself mid-course. Explanations come afterward, in memory, story, ritual, and reverence. In the quiet instruction passed from surviving elders to trembling children. In the lessons whispered at night as the world slowly calmed. As the waters began to recede, the world revealed a new shape, smaller, humbler, stripped of the weight that had distorted it. Entire landscapes had shifted. Valleys vanished into floodplains. Mountains had softened at their edges. Forests lay rearranged. Rivers carved new veins through the land. Everything bore the imprint of cleansing. And amidst this quiet transformation, survivors spoke of phenomena that lingered even as the world stilled. Doors appearing in unlikely places, thresholds made of light or shadow opening without touch. Some described them as boundaries resetting. Others saw them as glimpses into realms pulling away. No one passed through them, and none remained open for long. They were symbols, not paths, signs that the age of blending had ended. A door opening without a hand. A reminder that divine restraint had lifted, ancient laws had moved, and creation had reclaimed its rightful form. When the final echoes of the unleashing faded, the world was left in a state of profound exhaustion. Not despair, exhaustion. A stillness deeper than silence, as though every grain of sand needed time to remember how to be part of a stable earth again. Judgment had accomplished its work. The giants were gone. The structures of their dominion had collapsed. The weight they carried had returned to the ground. And humanity stood alone, not victorious but entrusted with remembrance. In the soft dawn of the first quiet morning, as mist rose from the reshaped waters, the few who survived understood something unspoken. The war had never truly been between heaven and giants. It had been between imbalance and order, between strain and return. And now, with the unleashing complete, creation waited for what would rise in the silence left behind. There are mornings in the memory of the world when sound itself seems unsure of its return, when the wind hesitates before crossing an empty field, and even the rivers move as though remembering something heavy they once carried. After the end of the giants, such mornings stretched across the land, quiet, fragile, hollow like the pause between two heartbeats. It was in this silence that humanity realized the world had survived, but it had changed forever. The judgment had passed, and what remained was not devastation alone, but absence. Ancient texts rarely describe ruins in detail. Instead, they describe the space left behind, valleys that felt too open, mountains that seemed too light, plains where the air carried no echo of heavy footsteps. These were places once shaped by the Nephilim's presence, now stripped of weight, purpose, and identity. The world felt unfinished. Humanity, scattered and weary, emerged slowly from their shelters. They stepped into landscapes they recognized yet no longer trusted. The ground was quieter, the rivers slower. Even the sky felt at a greater distance, as if watching from behind a veil. Rebuilding did not begin with tools or structures. It began with caution, with long pauses before crossing familiar paths, with tentative gatherings near water sources, with whispered conversations around small fires. Something vast had passed through the world, and every survivor carried an instinctive understanding. Its marks could never be erased. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. As people rebuilt, the stories they told began to change. The Nephilim were no longer spoken of as rulers, threats, or awe-inspiring figures. They became warnings, lessons wrapped in memory. Parents told their children of strength without restraint, of desire without humility, of power that forgets balance. These were not tales of victory. They were laments. Communities gathered to retell the events, not to celebrate survival, but to preserve meaning. The terror of judgment was not reenacted. Instead, the fragility of harmony became the central message. The world had been reshaped not by anger but by imbalance, and by the cost of ignoring limits meant to protect life. Nature, though quieter, did not fully recover. Lifespans shortened. Soil required more careful tending. Seasons regained pattern but not abundance. Everything felt closer to breaking, yet at the same time more precious. Tradition suggests that this fragility was not punishment. It was intentional, a recalibration that kept humanity aware of the thin line between order and collapse. Cooperation, once optional, became essential. Villages learned to share resources rather than hoard them. Travelers moved in groups rather than alone. Rituals returned, simple ones that honored the turning of seasons and the responsibilities of living gently upon the land. Fragility taught unity. Heaven, too, maintained a distance. Not cold, not punitive, protective. The closeness once taken for granted was now tempered by boundaries restored with care. The breach between realms that had allowed giants and watchers to cross had been sealed. The world was safer, but also more solitary. In that solitude, silence became a teacher. Footprints too large to follow still lingered in certain places, vast impressions pressed into hardened earth. But as seasons passed, winds carried dust into them. Grass sprouted at their edges. Slowly, bit by bit, these traces softened. They were not erased, but they were absorbed into the land, becoming part of the memory it carried. Humanity walked past them with reverence. Some laid stones in their shadows. Others whispered prayers, not in fear but in remembrance. For the silence left behind was not emptiness. It was space, space to choose differently, space to live with humility, space to remember what unchecked power can cost. And the world, still tender from judgment, waited to see what humanity would build within that space. Silence, true silence, does not simply mean the absence of sound. It means the absence of weight, the absence of pressure, the absence of a presence too large to ignore. In the world after the giants, this kind of silence settled over everything, like a thin veil drawn across creation. It was the silence of release, the silence of a world breathing again after bearing too much for too long. In the earliest days after the judgment, humanity moved with extraordinary care. The land felt unfamiliar, even where it looked unchanged. A hill that once echoed with the training of Nephilim warriors now sat still, its grass bending gently to the wind. A valley that had known the thunder of giant footsteps lay open and hollow, its air thin and strangely delicate. Villages that had once huddled beneath the shadow of tall fortresses now stood exposed beneath the wide sky, feeling both vulnerable and strangely free. People gathered in circles at dawn and dusk, not always to speak, but simply to sit. They listened to the world in its new quiet. Some said the earth felt lighter beneath their feet. Others said it felt older, as though exhaustion lingered in the soil. A few whispered that the world seemed smaller, not in size but in reach, that the vastness once felt by living under Nephilim dominion had contracted, leaving a more intimate, cautious horizon. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. As humanity adapted, they began reevaluating the stories they had inherited. The tales of the Nephilim, once filled with awe and dread, shifted into moral memory. These giants were no longer described in the tones of fascination or fear. They became symbols, lessons, warnings about the cost of tipping the scales of creation. Parents recited to their children, "Strength must walk with restraint. Knowledge without humility breaks the world. Power must bow to balance." These sayings became the pillars of a new world view guiding communities as they rebuilt. No longer did people seek dominion over nature, they sought harmony with it. They understood that creation had limits, and those who crossed them invited consequences not just for themselves, but for every living thing. Nature, though calmer, bore the imprint of what had happened. Forests regrew in uneven patterns. Rivers ran shallow where they once ran deep. Fertile fields required rest more often. Even the air carried a different texture, lighter, yet more fragile. Animals moved carefully as though sensing the world's recovery. The world did not return to its former abundance. It could not. The strain of ages had reshaped its structure. Lifespans shortened, a reminder of mortality embedded into the rhythm of life. Communities became smaller, more tightly bound, more reliant on cooperation to endure. Tradition suggests this fragility was not punishment but design, a recalibration to prevent the rise of imbalance. Heaven's distance also became a living reality. The closeness once felt in earlier ages, whispers in dreams, clarity in rituals, the subtle warmth of divine nearness, did not fully return. Heaven remained present, but from afar, like a guardian watching through a veil. This distance was not coldness, it was protection, a separation restored with intention, ensuring that realms once dangerously entwined would remain distinct. Humanity learned to live with this distance. Their prayers became quieter, humbler, not demands but offerings. Not requests for power but acknowledgments of responsibility. They prayed not for dominion but for memory. Let us remember what was lost. Let us remember why it happened. Memory became their final safeguard. In the silence after giants, memory shaped identity more deeply than monuments ever could. People carried stories from one village to another, from one generation to the next. They spoke of the world that was lost, the world they inherited, and the fragile responsibility placed upon them. And in certain places, valleys, riverbeds, abandoned plateaus, massive footprints remained pressed into the earth. Too large to follow, too deep to ignore. As seasons passed, dust gathered in them, rain pooled, small flowers took root in the cracks. Slowly, patiently, nature softened the marks of the giants, not erasing them, absorbing them. For some footprints are not meant to disappear. They are meant to remind. And humanity, moving through the silence of a restored world, understood the future would depend on whether they honored those reminders or repeated the mistakes that carved them. Silence endured, not as a void but as a teacher. In the eras that followed the judgment, humanity learned to listen in ways they had forgotten during the age of giants. They listened to the soil before planting. They listened to the wind before traveling. They listened to one another before making decisions. And beneath it all, they listened to the world's memory, the subtle echoes of what had once been nearly undone. The world was quieter but not empty. The absence of the giants created space that felt both eerie and sacred. It was a world learning its own contours again. The land no longer bore the weight of beings too large for its design, and in that relief came fragility, a reminder that creation, though resilient, could not endure endless strain. Humanity moved through this new world with caution shaped by reverence. Fields were tended sparingly. Forests were entered only with purpose. Rivers were approached with humility. People understood intuitively that the world had limits, and that these limits were not barriers but safeguards. Even children sensed it. They played softly, avoided deep shadows, and asked questions with wide, quiet eyes. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. As generations passed, the Nephilim shifted further from memory into myth. Their names faded, their deeds blurred, but their meanings sharpened. They had become the embodiment of a truth the new world needed to survive, that power without measure unravel. Else the very fabric it inhabits. Storytellers traveled from village to village, recounting the old tales not with the fire of legends but with the solemn cadence of warnings. They spoke of a world once stretched too far, of giants who confused strength for destiny, of watchers who regretted too late, and of a silence that followed, deeper than any the world had known. These were not fear stories told to frighten children. They were caution stories meant to anchor societies. Communities carved simple symbols into stone circles for balance, lines for separation, spirals for return. They marked entrances to homes, altars, gathering places, not as idols but as reminders. The world had boundaries, and those boundaries mattered. Nature, though no longer turbulent, carried a quiet caution in its rhythms. Spring arrived gently rather than exuberantly. Summers grew warm but rarely fierce. Winters were mild in some places, harsh in others, the world redistributing itself into a new pattern. Even the birdsong seemed more measured, as though creation itself had tempered its voice. People came to see the fragility of life not as a burden but as guidance. Shortened lifespans reminded them to value their days. Reduced abundance taught them to share. The world's modest stability urged them to preserve harmony. Heaven remained at a distance, watching without intrusion. The closeness once felt in older ages did not return, and humanity learned to live within that separation. Divine nearness was no longer expected. Instead, divine boundary became a form of protection, a shield keeping the world from repeating disaster. This heavenly distance shaped prayer. People no longer asked for intervention in every trouble. They prayed to remember. They prayed for wisdom. They prayed for steadiness in their own hearts. And while answers did not arrive in visions or voices, the world itself often replied in small ways: an unexpected harvest, a sudden rain, a safe journey. Subtle affirmations rather than overt signs. One thing, however, never lost its significance: the footprints. Scattered across old battlefields, along ridgelines, beside rivers that had changed their courses, lay the remnants of the giants, enormous impressions carved into stone and clay. For years they remained sharp-edged, startling. Then slowly, gently, they began to soften. Dusk gathered, grass crept in, rain pooled, then drained. And season by season, nature reclaimed even these colossal marks. Ancient travelers wrote that seeing a nearly filled footprint stirred conflicting emotions: sadness for what had been lost, relief for what had ended, and awe for the world's ability to reshape what once seemed immovable. Footprints too large to follow, slowly filled with dust. This image became a symbol across villages and tribes, a reminder that even the greatest forces eventually fade, and that memory must guide where their paths can no longer be seen. The silence after the giants was not emptiness. It was responsibility, a quiet world waiting for humanity to decide whether it would honor the fragile balance restored, or walk once again toward the edges of a law older than heaven. Some truths do not arrive with thunder. They arrive in whispers, quiet, steady, patient enough to wait until the world is still enough to hear them. The reason judgment fell upon the ancient world is one such truth. It does not roar through the ages. It lingers like a line drawn across deep water, thin, fragile, and impossibly steady against the current. To understand why the final war ended in divine correction, one must listen not to the noise of power, but to the quiet logic of balance. Ancient storytellers approach this question with a reverence that sets it apart from the rest of their narratives. They do not explain judgment through rage or vengeance. They do not invoke divine wrath as a sudden eruption of fury. Instead, they speak of refusal, a long, unwavering refusal that pushed creation past its limits. Not refusal of heaven by the Nephilim, but refusal of measure. The giants did not seek evil for its own sake. They sought permanence. They sought influence beyond the natural arc of life. They sought significance that would not fade. They resisted the ebb and flow woven into the world, the rise and fall meant for all beings bound to creation's rhythms. And in resisting those limits, they strained the fabric of existence itself. This is the truth ancient traditions return to again and again. The judgment came not because the Nephilim existed, but because they refused to exist within the boundaries that made existence possible. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Creation is built on balance, cycles of growth and decay, boundaries between realms, rhythms that maintain cohesion. When these rhythms are honored, life thrives. When they are violated, the world bends. But if that bending continues too long, something has to give. Creation cannot collapse, it must correct. Divine judgment, then, was not an act of anger. It was a cosmic recalibration, a restoration of order at the scale of reality itself. Storytellers describe this judgment not as a strike from above, but as a shift from within, boundaries reasserting themselves, laws older than heaven moving into place, balance reclaiming its authority. The giants fell not because they were hunted, but because they had placed themselves outside what creation could sustain. This explanation resists simplicity. It avoids painting the Nephilim as monsters, for many were not. It avoids depicting humanity as righteous, for they were not. It avoids casting heaven as vengeful, for judgment was not punishment, it was preservation. Traditions insist that without the unleashing, creation itself would have fractured under contradiction. The world cannot maintain cycles when some beings refuse to cycle. It cannot sustain harmony when some forces refuse to yield. It cannot endure imbalance without eventually collapsing into dissolution. Heaven acted not to destroy, but to protect what could still endure. Understanding this reframes the entire war. It was never a battle between heaven and giants. It was a confrontation between order and unraveling, between what must remain and what could no longer exist without tearing the world apart, between limitation honored and limitation defied. And in the quiet heart of this understanding lies the chapter's symbol, a line drawn in water holding, impossible to maintain by force, yet steady by principle, just as the laws of creation hold the world together when everything tries to push beyond measure. To understand why judgment was unleashed, one must step back from the scenes of collapse, the shattered fortresses, the rising waters, and look instead at the deeper tension woven through the age. Ancient storytellers insist that the true conflict was never between heaven and the Nephilim, nor between giants and humans. It was between balance and refusal, a refusal so persistent, so absolute, that it pushed creation toward a breaking point. In the long years before the unleashing, the Nephilim began to stretch themselves across the world in ways the earth was not designed to bear. Their strength was immense. Their lives were long. Their ambitions, once restrained by curiosity and wonder, grew into something more forceful, a longing to remain, to define, to command. Yet even this is not condemned in ancient writings. Desire itself was not the fault. The fault lay in how far that desire reached. The world is built on cycles, seasons, lifespans, rise and fading, beginnings and endings. Even mountains obey these rhythms. Even oceans shift within the limits set for them. But the giants, gifted with a lifespan that far exceeded human understanding, began to reject the principle of return. They sought to remain unchanged, unmoved by the rhythms governing everything else, and creation began to twist under that refusal. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The giants pushed not only against time, but against the laws that keep life coherent. They resisted separation between realms, between roles, between what belongs to heaven and what belongs to earth. They blurred boundaries meant to safeguard the world's structure, and once those boundaries thinned, everything else thinned with them. The Watcher's withdrawal, the fractures among the giants, the instability of nature, these were not random misfortunes. They were symptoms of a foundational imbalance that no world could sustain indefinitely. Ancient traditions teach that when boundaries collapse, reality frays. And when reality frays, something must intervene, not to punish, but to mend. Judgment, then, was not a divine outburst. It was creation's safeguard activating. Heaven acted because the world was sliding toward dissolution, and dissolution cannot be allowed to complete itself. These texts speak of existence as a tapestry woven with threads of order. Once enough threads are torn, the tapestry cannot hold. The intervention came not to erase the giant's presence, but to preserve the integrity of the tapestry itself. This is why storytellers frame judgment as correction. It corrected the imbalance, restored the separation, re-established the rhythms that give life its shape. Without this correction, the world would have cracked beneath the strain of contradictions, giants refusing limits, watchers regretting too late, humans caught in impossible tensions. Heaven's action did not glorify humanity. It simply acknowledged that humans, by their nature, still fit the world's measure. They rose and fell in the rhythm creation was designed to support. Their fragility, far from being weakness, made them sustainable. Their humility, when they remembered it, kept them aligned with the world's scale. Judgment preserved what could still be sustained. The war in this light becomes something entirely different from a cosmic clash. It becomes the inevitable transition between an untenable world and a restored one. The true enemy was never the Nephilim themselves. It was the dissolution that would have consumed everything had it continued unchecked. A line drawn in water is the perfect symbol of this truth. It should not hold. It should vanish immediately. Yet under the right conditions, with the right stillness, it can remain visible for a moment, clear, gentle, yet unmoving. That is balance. That is measure. That is the principle judgment sought to restore. And the world, for the first time in ages, began to move back toward that line, back toward order, back toward wholeness, back toward the boundaries that sustain life. To grasp why divine judgment was unleashed, one must look not at the destruction it brought, but at the unraveling that came before it. The ancient storytellers emphasized this again and again. Judgment arose not from wrath, but from the collapse of measure. The world had been stretched beyond what creation itself could carry. Something had to give, and what gave was restraint. Long before the waters rose, long before the mountains shifted, the world had already reached a dangerous threshold. The Nephilim had not meant to bring about dissolution. In their own minds, they were securing permanence. They were carving legacies into the land. They were shaping futures with their hands. But they did so without acknowledging the quiet truths that sustain existence, that every realm has boundaries, that every being has a place, and that balance is not a suggestion but a law. Their refusal to accept this law, slow, steady, relentless, became the fault line of the age. They refused limitation. They refused return. They refused to release what the world could not continue to hold. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Creation itself was showing signs of collapse. The land shook without cause. Seas encroached with no storms. Time faltered, stretching in some regions and compressing in others. Natural cycles fractured. Even the watchers, beings of foresight, sensed the unraveling but were powerless to reverse it. They had crossed boundaries once. Now they could not restore the very structure they had strained. Humanity, caught between divine distance and giant ambition, felt the world tilting underfoot. Their prayers grew thin. Their fears grew heavy. They watched as balance slipped away, piece by piece, until the world resembled a vessel holding too much weight on one side. The final war was not a war of soldiers or weapons. It was a war between order and dissolution. Each act of Nephilim defiance pulled the world closer to the brink. Each moment of imbalance strained the tapestry until threads snapped faster than they could be rewoven. Heaven's silence was not neglect. It was the last moment of patience before inevitability demanded response. And eventually, the demand could no longer be ignored. Ancient traditions say that judgment was necessary because without it, creation would have collapsed under contradiction. The Nephilim's existence stretched laws that had been perfect in their design. Those laws could bend for a time, even for generations, but they could not break. When the weight grew too great, the laws moved to restore themselves. Judgment followed because restoration required it. Heaven acted not to eradicate strength, but to prevent the cosmos from tearing apart. This reframes the entire age. The Nephilim were not annihilated because they were evil. They were undone because they were incompatible with the world's continuation. Humanity was not preserved because they were righteous. They were small enough to fit within the returning balance. Judgment was not wrath poured out but correction returning in. In this understanding, the final war loses its image of divine conflict and becomes something quieter, something inevitable. A convergence of natural law, divine restraint, and cosmic order. A world returning to itself after being stretched too far. And the ancient symbol that captures this truth is simple, delicate, impossible. A line drawn in water holding. It should dissolve. It should vanish. It should fade with the slightest motion. Yet there it remains for a moment, clear and straight. That is balance. That is measure. That is the principle judgment sought to restore. And when the world finally settled after the unleashing, humanity stood upon a renewed earth not with pride but with trembling. They understood that the war had never been about victory or defeat. It had always been about preservation of life, of order, of the fragile harmony that allows creation to endure. In the quiet that followed, the world seemed to whisper a single truth. Judgment came so that existence could continue. And in that whisper, the story of ages found its answer. Some stories end with triumph, others with ruin. But the oldest stories, the ones carried by wind, river, and bone, end with remembrance. Not the memory of events alone, but of the principles been. Eth them. After the Nephilim War, the world did not carve monuments or raise triumphant songs. Instead, it created something quieter, a memory woven into boundaries, rhythms, and the fragile beauty of limitation. The final chapter of that age is not written in stone. It is written in restraint. When the waters withdrew and the world steadied itself, the silence that followed did not feel like emptiness. It felt like instruction. Everywhere humanity looked, the land carried reminders of what had happened, not through scars but through limits. Days felt shorter, Seasons required gentler management. Harvests demanded care. Nature itself moved with a tenderness that warned against excess. These boundaries were not punishments, they were invitations. The world was teaching humanity how to remain within measure. Ancient traditions describe this period as the age of carefulness. People lived closer to one another. They listened more deeply to the earth. Villages planted with restraint, hunted with gratitude, built with humility. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that the strength of a world is not found in how much it can bear, but in how wisely its inhabitants honor the weight it cannot. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The memory of the giants remained, not in fear, but in awareness. Parents told their children not tales of terror or heroism, but stories of limits ignored, separation violated, power unmeasured. These stories did not glorify humanity, they grounded it. They whispered a truth the new world needed to survive. Power must answer to law. Desire must bow to balance. Strength must remember its place. The world itself reinforced this lesson. Systems that once seemed abundant now revealed their fragility. Rivers swelled unpredictably if mishandled. Fields flourished only when respected. Weather shifted subtly in response to the tone of human stewardship. Life had become an intricate dance of give and receive, a harmony easily disrupted. Heaven, from its restored distance, allowed humanity to walk the earth without constant intervention. This separation, once terrifying, became stabilizing. The world no longer needed to bear the presence of beings too heavy for its design. Humanity, smaller in scale and humbler in lifespan, fit the restored balance with unexpected grace. But the memory of judgment lingered. Communities carved simple symbols into wood and stone, circles, lines, small spirals representing return. None depicted giants falling or floods rising. Instead, they depicted boundaries, reminders that existence thrives not through boundlessness, but through honoring the edges of what is safe. The silence that followed the final war continued across generations. It was a silence that asked for reflection rather than explanation, a silence that held more wisdom than any proclamation could. It guided humanity gently toward a different kind of strength, the strength of understanding where not to step. And in some remote regions, impressions of ancient footsteps could still be found, barely visible now, softened by dust and time. Footprints not meant to terrify but to remind. Signs of a past where power outgrew wisdom, and the world nearly broke beneath its weight. Humanity walked past these fading marks with reverence, aware that memory was the safeguard granted to them. Judgment had ended the giants, but memory entrusted the survivors with a choice: to honor the limits that preserved the world, or to once again wander beyond them. The world that emerged after the Nephilim war was quieter, but the quiet was not simple. It carried layers, echoes of what had been, reminders of what must never return, and an unspoken invitation to live with greater awareness. Humanity stepped into this quiet cautiously, as though afraid to disturb something sacred resting beneath the surface of ordinary days. In this era, restraint became a way of life. People learned to look for signs not in the heavens, but in the earth. The way a river curved, the pattern of wind across grass, the subtle fatigue of soil. They understood now that creation was not an endless reservoir to be drawn from without thought, but a partner that required respect. This understanding was not taught through commandments. It was carried through memory, for the world still remembered. In the absence of giants, mountains no longer groaned under disproportionate weight. Valleys echoed differently, lighter, softer, without the heavy footsteps of beings too large for their spaces. Forests grew in slower rhythms, reshaping themselves after centuries of strain. Even the skies seemed to hold their breath a little longer each morning, as though honoring the renewed balance. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Humanity's understanding of power changed. Where once strength had been associated with dominance, it was now understood as endurance, not the endurance of towering figures, but the endurance of communities. who knew how to live within their means. Power was no longer the ability to impose one's will, but the wisdom to stay aligned with the world's fragile equilibrium. Parents taught their children that the greatest tragedies in history came not from weakness, but from excess. Stories of the Nephilim no longer focused on their size or might, but on the subtle moment when desire outpaced wisdom. These stories warned that the world remembers imbalance, and that remembrance shapes the future. Human prayer changed too. It became a practice of humility rather than petition, a quiet acknowledgement of one's place within creation. People did not pray for greatness, they prayed for steadiness. They prayed for the strength to honor limits. They prayed to remain small enough, humble enough, wise enough to belong in a world still healing. And although heaven did not draw close as it had in ages past, humanity felt watched, not with scrutiny but with expectancy. As though the divine waited not to intervene, but to see whether the restored world would hold. The silence that followed the judgment was not emptiness. It was reflection made space, a sacred pause for mankind to learn the lesson written into the earth. In some places, remnants of the giants' presence endured, but not as monuments. A massive stone displaced unnaturally far from any mountain, a valley whose contours bore the imprint of ancient conflict. Footsteps, once sharp impressions, now softened by centuries of dust. These traces were no longer frightening. They were instructive, a reminder that even the strongest can fall when they refuse to remain within their design. A reminder that creation bends, but only so far. A reminder that the cost of imbalance is always paid in the currency of worlds. Communities traveling through such regions often paused in reverence. They touched the ground where ancient feet once stood, not to relive the past, but to remember the boundary it taught them. In time, these places became quiet sanctuaries, sites not of worship but of reflection, for memory had become life's final safeguard, and memory whispered a single truth through every softened footprint, every shortened lifespan, every fragile harvest. The world endures when its inhabitants honor the limits that shape it. The world's remembrance did not fade with time, it deepened. As generations rose and fell, the memory of the Nephilim War transformed from history into wisdom, from event into principle. Humanity carried this memory not through monuments or grand retellings, but through restraint, woven quietly into daily life. And in this restraint, the world found stability again. People awakened each morning aware of the fragile harmony they inhabited. Dawn felt different now, lighter, crisper, as though the world exhaled with each sunrise. Evenings carried a gentle stillness, a sense that creation was listening. This awareness shaped how villages planted their fields, gathered water, raised their children. They measured their actions carefully, knowing excess carried the shadow of old mistakes. The absence of the giants remained a dominant feature of the world's atmosphere. Their disappearance had left behind an emptiness, but it was an emptiness that taught rather than frightened. Hillsides once altered by their hands grew wild again. Riverbanks reshaped by their steps now softened with reeds and flowers. The world healed slowly, unevenly, and not without scars, but it healed in ways that honored the balance restored. Yet something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The silence after the judgment became a kind of teacher, guiding humanity in ways more profound than speech. This silence asked a simple question: will you honor the limits that sustain you? Communities responded by embedding memory into their culture. They marked thresholds with simple carvings, lines, circles, boundaries. They told stories not of the giants' downfall, but of their refusal to remain within measure. Children learned from an early age that power is safest when it knows its place. Elders reminded their people that separation between realms was not a barrier but a mercy. And throughout the land, remnants of the old world stood as quiet witnesses, footprints preserved in stone-filled basins. Massive depressions in earth where Nephilim once stood, canyons shaped not by water alone but by the passing of beings too heavy for the world's design. These marks did not inspire fear, they inspired reflection. Travelers approached them slowly, stepping around the edges with reverence. Some left small offerings of grain or flowers. Others stood in silence, allowing the immensity of the past to settle in their hearts. These footprints, slowly filling with dust, served as a profound symbol. Some paths are not meant to be followed, and some strengths are not meant to be pursued. Humanity learned to read this quiet lesson. They realized the world now depended on their discretion, that the balance restored by Judd G-Ment could be protected only through humility. That memory was not a burden but a shield. Heaven, watching from a distance reestablished by necessity, allowed creation to shape the future without direct intervention. This distance, once terrifying, became comforting. It meant boundaries were honored again. It meant the laws older than heaven held firm. It meant the earth was safe from the weight of beings it could no longer carry. Still, the silence remained, not cold, not empty, but instructive. A sacred stillness waiting for human hearts to remember what their ancestors nearly lost. Traditions say that those who listen carefully can still feel this silence in certain places. Mountain passes at dusk, deep forests at dawn, river mouths just before rain. In these places, the world seems to whisper, "Remember, remember why limits matter." For the memory of the giants is not carved in stone, it is carved in restraint, in every choice to keep power small, in every decision made with care. In every moment humanity steps back instead of forward, in every boundary honored without resentment. This is how the world remembers, through the quiet, humble acts that preserve balance, through the fragile systems that demand cooperation, through the lineage of stories that carry warning and wisdom intertwined. And in this remembrance lies the world's continued hope, that those who walk the earth will choose differently than those who once towered above it. For memory, at last, is what saves the world from repeating its oldest wounds.